Welcome back to Notes of Curiosity, exploring ideas that matter. We're tackling Two Greatest Ideas by Linda Zagzewski. I'm Alex, and super excited to dig into this with our resident expert, Eve.
Always happy to dive into a good book,
Yeah.
especially one by Zagzewski. I mean, she's really a leading philosopher.
Yeah, and this book, well, it's pretty ambitious. It's like she's trying to trace the evolution of, I don't know, like the biggest ideas that shaped how we see ourselves, the whole universe, everything.
Oh, definitely ambitious, but she pulls it off. She really makes you think.
So idea number one, buckle up. It's the belief that we, with our little human minds, can actually grasp the universe, the whole thing.
And you think, well, but that wasn't always a given. Early humans, they were busy surviving, making tools, figuring out agriculture, even creating art.
But not necessarily like pondering the cosmos. They weren't building telescopes or writing grand theories of everything.
Right, it's like they were focused on the here and now, the practical stuff. Zagzewski argues this shift towards a more unified worldview happened around the first millennium BC.
A real turning point. She introduces some fascinating figures from that time, like Thales. He's often considered the father of both science and philosophy.
I love that she tells that story about him predicting a bumper olive harvest using his knowledge of the stars.
Talk about knowledge is power. He rents all the olive presses and makes a fortune.
It's a great story, and it really illustrates how understanding the universe, the big picture, can have very real-world applications.
But Thales? He's just the beginning. Zagzewski takes us through ancient Greece, introducing us to philosophers like Anaximander and Anaximenes.
And these guys, they were all about finding that one fundamental substance underlying everything, that single thing that makes up all of reality.
It's this search for unity, for that underlying principle that connects everything. And this wasn't just a Greek thing either.
Oh, absolutely. She shows how this pops up in different cultures and times, like world religions, for instance.
Hinduism, Buddhism. You even see it in monotheistic religions like Judaism and Christianity.
Right, this idea of a personal God who chooses to create the universe. That's in the Hebrew Bible. Zagzewski argues that this emphasizes something really important, the idea that the universe didn't have to be this way.
It was a deliberate act, a choice.
Yeah.
And that opens the door to discovery, right?
Totally. If it's not predetermined, well, then we can explore it. We can try to understand it. Zagzewski even quotes a passage from the book of Jeremiah where God's actually challenging people.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What does it say?
It's like God saying, stand at the crossroads and look. Ask for the ancient paths where the good way lies, walk in it, and find rest for your souls.
Whoa, powerful stuff. Like an invitation to step outside ourselves, our limited human view, and to see things from a bigger perspective.
Exactly. It's about connecting to that larger framework, trying to understand our place in the whole scheme of things.
And this leads to the idea of natural law, right? These universal principles governing, well, everything. The physical world and even morality.
That's it. Zagzewski traces the evolution of this idea from the Stoics in ancient Greece all the way to Aquinas and his concept of an eternal law that governs the universe.
Wow. So this idea has some serious staying power.
It really does. It's a thread that runs through Western thought. It sets the stage for things like universal human rights and even the very concept of scientific laws.
It's the idea that there's order, purpose, even in the things we can't see.
And it's not just limited to philosophy and religion either. Zagzewski shows how this first great idea pops up in art, architecture, even literature.
It's like a universal language, expressing this idea of unity across different forms of human creativity.
Think about it. The jade carvings in Neolithic China, the body painting of the Amazonian people, the Roman Pantheon, medieval cathedrals, even Byzantine icons.
It's amazing when you think about it. All these different cultures, separated by time and distance, and yet they're all expressing the same basic idea.
The desire to depict the world and our place in it.
It's like, even though these expressions are so diverse, they all share this sense of a unified cosmos.
And it goes even deeper. It shapes how stories are told. Think about ancient Greek epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey.
Those classic tales of heroes and gods.
Zagzewski leans on Aristotle's view of poetry here. She argues that these epics aren't just stories, they represent universal truths. And the characters, well, they're more like types than individuals.
So instead of focusing on the inner workings of one person, they use these larger-than-life figures to explore what it means to be human.
Exactly. Courage, cunning, how we deal with fate, all these fundamental things. And the setting for these epics is often what Mikhail Bakhtin called a completed past.
Okay, what does that mean? A completed past?
Zagzewski points out that this creates a sense of distance, a separation between the world of the epic and the world of the reader.
It's like stepping into a different realm, a world where these grand dramas play out on a timeless stage.
That's a great way to put it. And this contrasts sharply with the rise of the novel, which comes later, alongside the second great idea.
And the novel, it's all about the present moment, the inner world of the individual.
Right. But before we jump into that second great idea, I'm curious about how this first one, the focus on the cosmos, shaped ethical thought.
Yeah, me too. Morality and the universe. How did those two things connect?
Well, Zagzewski argues that for a long time, being moral was seen as living in harmony with the natural order. The Pythagoreans, for example, believed that these harmonious laws, these natural laws, they applied to everything.
The entire cosmos.
Yeah.
Including us.
Even us, our souls, and even the way we organize society.
So your personal ethics were linked to a just society, and both reflected a larger cosmic harmony. That's a big idea.
It is, and you see it reflected in Plato's Republic. The structure of society mirrors the structure of the individual soul.
And Zagzewski points out that you can't understand justice in the individual without understanding justice in society, which itself is part of the even bigger picture, the cosmos.
It's like those Russian nesting dolls. Each one fits inside the other.
And Aristotle's take on ethics, that also connects to this first great idea, right? He was all about eudaimonia, human flourishing.
Right, and he believed that was determined by human nature. And human nature, well, that's part of a larger natural order.
So to be truly happy, to flourish, you have to understand your place in the cosmos and live in a way that's aligned with it.
Exactly. And get this, for Aristotle, the highest good for humans was actually contemplation of the cosmos.
Like stargazing, reading philosophy.
Well, yeah, I guess you could say that. But the point is, knowledge and understanding, they weren't just intellectual pursuits. They were directly tied to ethical fulfillment.
That's so different from today, where we tend to see the universe as morally neutral, like it's just there. But for most of human history, goodness was about fulfilling your purpose within a divinely ordered cosmos.
And this leads to another fascinating part of the first great idea, this concept of transcending the self, of the soul uniting with something greater.
So we're talking about going beyond our individual limits, merging with something bigger.
Exactly. Zagzewski discusses this idea of henosis from Neoplatonism. It's about the human soul achieving unity with the one.
It's almost like that image of a drop of water merging with the ocean, losing its individual identity but becoming part of something vast and infinite.
I love that analogy. And she even quotes Plotinus, one of the key figures in Neoplatonism. He describes this experience of unity. He says, many times it has happened, lifted out of the body into myself, becoming external to all other things and self-centered, beholding a marvelous beauty, then, more than ever, assured of community with the loftiest order, enacting the noblest life, acquiring identity with the divine.
Wow. Talk about a powerful description. You can always feel that sense of transcendence, that connection to something beyond the self.
And similar ideas pop up in other traditions, too, like in Hinduism, where the individual soul, Atman, is seen as identical to the ultimate reality, Brahman.
So enlightenment comes from recognizing that we're all connected, that separation is an illusion.
It's a very different perspective from the Western emphasis on the individual, right? But it highlights just how powerful this idea of unity is.
Even as the first great idea evolved, its impact remained. Thinkers like Spinoza, he might have rejected traditional ideas about God, but he still talked about this intellectual love for God.
This love that leads to unity with the divine mind.
It's like even when we move away from traditional religion, that longing for connection with something bigger doesn't just disappear.
It's a deep human need. And even Bertrand Russell, Mr. Logic and Reason himself.
Wait, Bertrand Russell, the staunch atheist.
The one and only. Even he acknowledged the power of this idea. At the end of his book, The Problems of Philosophy, he writes, through the greatness of the universe which philosophy contemplates, the mind also is rendered great and becomes capable of that union with the universe which constitutes its highest good.
It's like even someone like Russell, who rejected any kind of personal God or spiritual realm, was still drawn to this idea of connecting with something larger than himself.
It's a powerful concept. And even as the first great idea gives way to the second, this longing for unity, for transcendence, it sticks around.
It's like a thread woven through human thought and experience, always there, even as our understanding of ourselves and the universe keeps changing.
And speaking of change, that brings us to the second great idea, the shift in focus from the cosmos to the self. But that's a story for another time. Okay, so we've been talking about that first great idea, the mind grasping the universe. But things start to shift around the 17th century. Zagzewski calls this the second great idea, where the focus turns inward to the self.
So we go from the cosmos to me, myself, and I.
Exactly, it's a big shift. And Zagzewski points to some major things that were happening at the time, like the Reformation.
Right. That was a huge shakeup in the religious landscape.
It really was. People started questioning the authority of the church, and individual conscience became more important. And then you've got the scientific revolution.
Where observation and experimentation took center stage.
And that also shifted the emphasis from relying on old authorities to, like, trusting your own senses, your own ability to reason. All these movements, they really set the stage for a new way of understanding the mind and its place in the world.
So instead of looking out at the universe for answers, we start looking in.
Exactly. It's like this inner journey begins. And no one embodies the shift better than René Descartes.
Oh, Descartes. I think, therefore I am.
That's the one. Zagzewski points out that his method of doubt, of questioning everything, led him to the one undeniable truth, his own thinking self.
It seems so simple, but it really changes everything.
It really does. It makes the mind, the individual, the starting point for knowledge.
It flips the script completely. Before, knowledge started with God or the cosmos. Now it's all about the self.
And this focus on the self, it keeps developing. Thinkers like John Locke come along. Zagzewski explains how Locke's theory of ideas, becomes super influential.
Refresh my memory. What was that theory all about?
Locke said that the mind, it doesn't just passively receive knowledge, it actively builds its understanding of the world. And it does this from experience, from the ideas it forms based on sensory data.
So our minds are like these little construction crews, building our reality brick by brick from our experiences.
That's a great way to put it. It's a huge break from the old ways of thinking. And it lays the groundwork for centuries of philosophical exploration into things like consciousness, perception, you name it.
Okay, so if knowledge starts with the self, with our individual experiences, how do we know that we're accurately reflecting the world outside of ourselves?
That, my friend, is the million-dollar question. Philosophers have been wrestling with this ever since. Descartes and Locke tried to address this by separating qualities into two categories.
Primary and secondary.
You got it. Primary qualities were seen as objective, independent of the observer. Things like size, shape, motion, they were thought to exist in the world, whether or not we're there to perceive them.
And secondary qualities.
Those are subjective, dependent on the perceiver. Things like color, taste, smell. It's like that old, if a tree falls in the forest question.
Right. Does it make a sound if no one's there to hear it?
Right.
We assume it still has size and shape, but the sound, that seems to depend on someone being there to experience it.
Exactly. But this distinction, it leads to more questions than answers. George Berkeley, who came after Locke, he challenged this whole idea. He argued that all qualities, even the so-called primary ones, they're all mind-dependent.
So, in a way, he's taking that focus on the self even further.
He really is. For Berkeley, to be is to be perceived. It's a pretty radical claim. It's like he's saying the first great idea, the universe, it all boils down to the second, the self.
So we're moving further and further away from that cosmos-centered view towards a self-centered one. And that raises some big questions about reality, about what we can actually know.
Big questions indeed. And that leads us to Immanuel Kant. He's trying to navigate this whole mess to find some middle ground.
Kant, he was a heavy hitter in philosophy.
He really was. And he comes up with this concept called transcendental idealism.
Okay, that sounds complicated. How does that help us understand this divide?
Well, Kant agreed with Berkeley that our minds shape our experience of the world. But he also wanted to hold on to the idea of a reality that exists outside of us.
So our minds are shaping things, but there's still a real world out there.
That's the idea. He proposed that we have these innate categories of understanding built into our minds. These categories structure how we perceive things. But there's still a thing in itself, a reality that exists beyond our experience.
So it's like we're looking at the world through a pair of glasses. Our minds are the glasses.
That's a great analogy. The glasses shape what we see, but there's still something out there, even if we can only experience it through the filter of our perception.
So Kant's trying to bridge the gap between the subjective, our inner world, and the objective, the world outside of us.
Exactly. It's a delicate balance. And he's saying that we can't ignore the role of the mind, but we also can't deny that there's something beyond our minds.
It creates this tension between what's inside and what's outside. And that tension, well, it's still shaping how we think today.
Oh, absolutely. And it plays out in so many areas. science, ethics, art, you name it. For instance, with this second great idea, morality changes. It's no longer about conforming to some cosmic order.
It becomes more about the individual.
Exactly. Individual autonomy becomes the basis for making ethical choices. Zagzewski points out how this ties into the emphasis on human rights, the importance of individual differences.
So instead of looking to some external rulebook, we start looking inward to our own reason, our own conscience.
That's the idea. The self becomes the ultimate source of value. But of course that raises new questions, new challenges.
Like if everyone just does what they think is right, doesn't that lead to chaos? Some kind of moral free-for-all.
That's the worry. Kant himself, he tried to ground morality in reason, arguing that there are these universal principles that any rational being would recognize.
So even though we're focusing on individual freedom, there's still this need for some kind of shared moral framework.
Right, some way to figure out right and wrong that goes beyond just personal preference. And that tension, that balancing act between individual freedom and a shared moral compass, well, that's still a hot topic today.
It's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
This second great idea, it shakes things up. It leads to progress in science, a deeper understanding of ourselves, and more focus on individual rights. But it also comes with its own set of questions and challenges.
Definitely a mixed bag. But Zagzewski, she argues that this tension between the first and second great ideas, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's a dynamic tension. It's what drives us forward.
So instead of trying to solve this tension, we need to learn to live with it, to see the value in both perspectives.
I think that's what she's getting at. She sees this tension playing out in other areas too, like in the arts.
Okay, how so?
Well, think about the rise of perspective in painting during the Renaissance.
Those incredible paintings with depth and realism.
Those are the ones. Zagzewski sees that as a visual representation of this shift toward a more subjective understanding of reality.
So instead of just trying to show the world as it is, artists started showing us how it appears to the individual, acknowledging that our perception shapes our reality.
Exactly. And you see this even more in movements like Impressionism, where artists are capturing those fleeting impressions of light and color.
It's all about the individual's experience of the world.
And then, bam, you have the explosion of abstract art in the 20th century.
Where the focus shifts almost entirely to the artist's inner world.
Emotions, ideas, experiences that aren't necessarily tied to the outside world. It's like art becomes this mirror reflecting how our understanding of the self is changing.
More focus on subjectivity, individuality, the whole inner landscape. But does this mean that art loses its ability to connect us to something bigger? To that sense of unity we talked about with the first great idea?
That's a great question, and I think it's complicated. Focusing on individual experience can make it harder to find those universal themes that connect us across time and cultures. But expressing our unique inner worlds, well, that can be a way of reaching out to others.
It's like offering a window into our soul. And maybe that creates space for empathy and understanding.
Exactly. But it takes a willingness to be open, to see things from another person's point of view.
So maybe it's a different kind of connection, one that's built on individual expression, but also on a willingness to see through another person's eyes.
I think you're onto something there. And Zagzewski doesn't stop at painting. She even brings up architecture. She contrasts the Roman Pantheon, a symbol of unity and cosmic order, with Frank Gehry's Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao.
Two very different buildings. What makes them such good examples of these contrasting ideas?
Well, the Pantheon, with that perfect dome and its connection to Pythagorean ideas about mathematical harmony, it really embodies that first great idea. It's like this monument to the cosmos, designed to evoke awe and reverence.
And the Guggenheim.
Gehry's Guggenheim, with all those curves and angles, it breaks the mold. It celebrates the individual vision of the architect.
It's like a statement of individuality.
Exactly. And in a way, it reflects the dynamism of the modern self, always changing and evolving.
It's fascinating how architecture, like art, can reflect the ideas of a particular time.
It really is. And Zagzewski shows how these two great ideas, the cosmos and the self, they've shaped not just our thinking, but the very world we've built.
It's all connected. But where do we go from here? How do we reconcile these seemingly opposing forces?
That's where Zagzewski introduces a third great idea.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground. First, the mind grasping the universe, then the mind grasping itself. Now, you mentioned a third great idea that could bridge these two. I'm all ears.
This is where things get really interesting. Zagzewski proposes that this third great idea is the idea that the human mind can grasp other minds.
So not just me, and not just the universe, but like you and me.
Exactly. It's about intersubjectivity. That ability to connect with and understand the experiences of other people, not as objects, but as subjects, people with their own inner lives.
It's like acknowledging that we're not alone in our heads.
Right. And Zagzewski suggests that this could be the key to a more complete understanding of, well, everything. Ourselves and the world around us. It brings together the individual and the collective, the subjective and the objective.
It's like it takes the best of both worlds. The first great idea, it can sometimes overlook the individual, right? And the second, the focus on the self, well, that can lead to isolation. So maybe this third idea offers a way to integrate those perspectives.
That's exactly what she's getting at. We need to move beyond a purely individual or purely cosmic view and recognize that we're all interconnected.
Okay, but how do we actually do that? How do we go beyond seeing people as just objects and truly grasp their experiences?
Zagzewski has some ideas. She talks about empathy, the ability to see the world from someone else's perspective, and the importance of really listening, not just hearing the words, but trying to understand the meaning behind them.
So it's more than just passively taking in information. It's actively trying to connect with the person who's sharing their thoughts and feelings.
Exactly. And it takes a willingness to be open to perspectives that might be different from our own, to challenge our own assumptions and biases, to recognize that our own understanding is always limited and that we can learn from others.
This makes me think about education. What if we moved away from a model that's all about individual achievement and competition and focused more on collaboration, where students learn from each other's unique perspectives?
That's a great example. Zagzewski also talks about politics. She suggests that instead of having this adversarial win-lose kind of dynamic, we need to find more collaborative ways to make decisions.
So less fighting, more talking.
Well, yes, it's about being willing to listen to people who hold different views, not to try and change their minds, but to understand where they're coming from and find some common ground.
It's easy to say, but it's hard to do, especially these days.
It is a challenge, and Zagzewski acknowledges that developing this kind of intersubjectivity, it's not easy. It requires change both within ourselves and in the systems and structures around us. We need to cultivate qualities like empathy and compassion, but we also need to create spaces where dialogue and understanding can flourish.
It's about seeing that we're all connected, not just as individuals, but as part of a larger community, a global society, even the natural world.
And that this interconnectedness, it's not a limitation, it's a source of strength. It means we can accomplish more when we work together, when we share our knowledge and resources.
It sounds like this third great idea has the potential to create a more just, equitable, and sustainable world.
It really does. It's a powerful idea. And even though it's still developing, Zagzewski's book makes a strong case for why it's worth exploring.
Eve, this has been an amazing deep dive. Thanks so much for guiding us through these ideas.
It's been my pleasure. These are ideas that we all need to be thinking about.
And to our listeners, if you're looking for a book that will challenge you, expand your thinking, and leave you with plenty to ponder, we highly recommend checking out Two Greatest Ideas by Linda Zagzewski.
This is Alex and Eve.
Thanks for joining us. Until next time, keep those notes of curiosity flowing.